Section 10 of The Seen and the Unseen by Richard Marsh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sonia. 5. The Tipster. An Impossible Story. 2. It was the Tuesday morning afterwards. Mr. Major was at the house in Campden Hill Gardens in the capacity of painting master. Towards the close of the lesson he asked his pupil a question. "Have you been to the Academy yet?" Miss Davidson was in the enjoyment of her own fortune. It may therefore be taken for granted that she was of age. But she was more than that. She was in touch with those teachings of the age which tells us that a young woman can do without a chaperon. Her painting lessons were, as a rule, sacred to herself and her master, which perhaps enabled her to better concentrate her mind upon the searchings after art. "Not yet. I suppose I ought to have gone, but I really seem to have so much else to do." Mr. Major said nothing. Perhaps he felt that even the most earnest searcher after art might be excused from attending that academy. Anyhow, that afternoon he himself was there. It was not his first visit by any means. He could have pointed out blindfold where all the most notorious pictures were. The position of one especial canvas he knew particularly well. It was in a far corner of the room, in a bad light, just above the line, exactly the position in which an indifferent work by an unknown man would escape the casual visitor's eye. Mr. Major felt this very strongly as he approached that corner. The rooms were crowded, though not on that occasion overcrowded, but just there was not a soul. Apparently his picture was not attracting the least attention. Nothing is more unsatisfactory to a struggling artist than to be aware of that. He advanced towards the slighted work of art with an uncomfortable feeling about the pit of his stomach. Suddenly he started. He hurried forward. The frame was starred. "By Jove!" he exclaimed out loud. "Gill was right. It's sold." In his surprise he was unconscious of the fact that he was staring at the frame as though he were paralyzed by the merits of the painting. But others saw him. More people came to stare. Then he enjoyed that rarest of all rare pleasures, the pleasure which the gentleman enjoyed in Lord Lytton's novel The Disowned, the pleasure of hearing his work criticised with perfect frankness. A gentleman made an observation to a lady who was evidently his wife. "Don't care for that kind of thing," he said. "I think it's silly," she replied. They moved on. A gentleman, obviously a country gentleman, stared at the picture for perhaps 2 seconds. "What's it all about?" he inquired of a friend. "Don't ask me. Some stuff or other." And they moved on. Then 2 parsons commented as they went by. One of them was a dictatorial sort of person. He pointed out the picture with his umbrella. "If I wanted an example to point the remark that I was just making, there is one. I say that art in England must be at a low ebb indeed, when they're obliged to admit that sort of thing." "The colouring's not bad," ventured his companion, who did not appear to be quite so critical. "Colouring? Pooh! Properly speaking, there is no colouring. That is, if you mean colour." "Shows some idea of drawing." "Drawing! After that, my good fellow, we'd better go and look at something else. Say a Punch and Judy." "Mr. Major!" As the 2 parsons were moving off, possibly in search of that Punch and Judy, the lucky artist, who seemed to have so hit the popular fancy, heard himself addressed by name. Turning, there was Miss Davidson. Mr. Major was momentarily confounded. "Where is your picture, Mr. Major?" "Here is my daub." "Daub?" The pupil seemed surprised. The master's manner was certainly ferocious. "Why do you call it a daub?" "I only call it what other people call it, and some fool or other has bought it." "Mr. Major!" Miss Davidson drew herself back with distinct frigidity. Her naturally pale face, if possible, grew paler. Mr. Major immediately perceived how grossly he had blundered. "Forgive me, Miss Davidson. I mean that some good friend, with whom charity is esteemed a virtue, has been generous to me." "But why should you suppose anything of the kind? Why should you suppose that a person would buy a picture he did not like, and for more than it is worth?" "Why, Miss Davidson? Why?" He stood leaning on the handrail, his eyes on her. Her eyes she kept upon the catalogue. "It sounds ridiculous, but do you know that I am acquainted with a person who thinks himself a prophet, and he told me that this week someone would buy my picture." "He need not be a prophet to have told you that." Lifting her eyes, she looked him full in the face. "Hadn't we better be moving? Someone else may wish to look at the picture as well as we." She smiled as she said this. He flushed. "But what made you say so bitterly just now that your picture was a daub?" "I had been the unintentional listener of the public verdict. Besides," he flung back his head with a petulant gesture, "do I not know myself that it is a daub? Do I not know what I meant it to be, and what it is? Do I not know how far it falls short of what I dreamed?" She was silent for a moment. Then she asked a question. "I have more than once wanted to ask you, do you think there is nothing worth living for but art?" "Indeed, I don't." "I thought you didn't." There was a dryness in her tone which stung him, especially after the glance with which his words had been pointed. He spoke coldly. "There is only one thing better." "Frankly, I am not quite sure what is my own mind upon the matter. There is so much talked about that sort of thing, but really I doubt if there is anything better worth living for than art." "For a man there is a woman." "You mean, I suppose, that for a man there are women." "Miss Davidson, don't say that." He put his hand upon her arm. His face was eager and flushed. "That, if you like, is the cant of the day. There is only one woman for a man." She laughed. "Suppose I put the converse, and say that for a woman there are men." "Miss Davidson, that is not true." She laughed again, this time a little nervously. "Don't let us stand in the middle of the room. Pray, let us keep moving on." Just then some acquaintances came up, acquaintances of hers, but not of his. He left her with them. He wandered off into the sculpture gallery, which, so far as the general and appreciative public were concerned, he found, as usual, a howling wilderness. "I wonder what I could do to win her love?" This was the question which that young man addressed to himself among those lonely statues. "I wonder if it could be won. By me? If it is won already?" As this last thought occurred to him, he actually trembled, which showed that, as a young man, he was something out of the common. "One thing is necessary, that I should not come to her a pauper. I don't want the tale of the Lord of Burleigh told in just one more new edition. I wonder if I could do something to make money." Mr. Philip Major had the first-floor apartments in a house in Stamford Street. Mr. Thompson Gill had the ground-floor rooms. Thus chance, or necessity, had made the tipster and the artist acquainted. That night Mr. Major entered Mr. Gill's sitting-room, an uninvited guest. "Well, Gill, old man, been doing anything more in the prophetic line?" Mr. Gill, his hands in his trouser pockets, was seated, staring into vacancy. "Mr. Major." He got up. With a mysterious air he approached his visitor. "I do believe there's something wrong." "How wrong? Has the prophetic tap run dry?" "I tell you straight, I wish it had run dry. It's quite upsetting me, that's what it's doing. What do you think of the Exmouth Stakes?" "What about the Exmouth Stakes?" "I placed the first 3 horses. That's what's about it. And I sent them to all my correspondents. I'm making all their fortunes. I am, straight. Why, you know, I'm a tipster. That's what I am, and I ain't ashamed to own it. But though I've been a tipster I don't know how many years, I mention it to you in confidence that I don't know no more about horses than you do. Perhaps not so much. The way I do, in general's this. I take the list of probable starters, and I sent one horse to one cove, and the second horse to another cove, and so on right through the whole boiling. So somehow, you see, I'm bound to strike the winner, and I don't forget to mention it. But of late I've been upsetting all my regular arrangements. Only the other day I sat down to sort out the bag of tricks as usual, but, if you'll believe me, I couldn't do it. Do you think I could send every man a different animal? Not me. I sent the same animal to all the lot of 'em, and the queerest part of it is, the beggar won. When I see that in the evening paper, I tell you I did feel funny. When, the next day, I began dealing them round again, I couldn't do it no more than before. I sent the first 3 horses to every half-a-crown subscriber, and they romped in just exactly as I'd placed them. That was on Friday, in the Billingsgate Stakes. On Saturday, when I saw you in the Strand, I'd just done the same in the Chichester Handicap. Yesterday was Monday, and there wasn't no racing, but today, in the Exmouth Stakes, I've placed the first 3 horses in the exact order that they came past the post. What do you think of that for a record? Wouldn't you say that there was something wrong with the works? It does you great credit, Gil. It isn't so much the horses. I shouldn't mind if it was only them. But it's everything. I can't think of what has happened, but everything that's going to happen I can see quite well. Are you in earnest? Try me and see. If there's anything you want to know about what's going to happen in the middle of next week, apply here for information. It's awful. I'm getting a regular freak of nature. Do you know, if what you say is correct, you could easily make your fortune — and mine. I suppose I could. If, for instance, you were to act on your own tips. Just so. Then why don't you? I'll tell you one reason why I don't. Because I can't see what's coming. But if you can, that's exactly the reason why you should. There's one thing coming tomorrow, and that's an end of me. What do you mean? By this time tomorrow I'll be dead. You're carrying it too far, my friend. I am carrying it too far. I feel I am. I know I am. That's where it is. I don't only see the things I want to see, but I see the things I don't want to see, and I see that by this time tomorrow I'll be dead. Dead, sitting in that chair." Mr. Gill pointed to the chair from which he had lately risen. Mr. Major eyed him. There certainly was something curious about the little man, although he spoke with a matter-of-fact straightforwardness which deprived his words of half their singularity. "Don't be an ass, Gill. Perhaps you can tell me what, by this time tomorrow night, will have happened to me?" You'll have made your fortune." Mr. Major laughed at this. "Thanks awfully. Perhaps you can assist me with a tip or two?" "That's just what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you all tomorrow's winners. You'll go down. You'll take every farthing you can beg, borrow, or steal. You'll put the whole pile on the first race at starting prices. You'll put the whole pile on again, with all your winnings, on the second race, and you'll do the same on every race, and at the end of the day you'll have won — what a pot!" "Yes, what a pot! But suppose, in this going the whole hog system of yours, once, only once, I should happen to lose, where shall I be then?" "You won't lose. You will win. Take a piece of paper and write down the names of the winners." Smilingly, perching himself on the edge of the table, Mr. Major took an envelope out of his pocket. He prepared to write upon the back of it. "Now then, my Gill." Mr. Gill took a newspaper from the table. For a moment he studied it attentively. "It's a long programme tomorrow. There are 7 events upon the card. The first is at 1:30. Mind you're there. The Blenheim Plate. Ladybird will win that. Write it down." Mr. Major wrote it down, still smiling. "The Windsor Stakes, King Bruce. The Maiden Plate, Sweet Violet. The Churchill Handicap, Devil's Own. The Visitors' Plate, Estrella. The Hunt Cup, Ballet Girl." Mr. Gill folded up the newspaper. "Got 'em all down? No mistakes, you know. That's 6 races. That'll be enough for you. You'll have made your pot by then, and what a pot it will be." Mr. Major, as he echoed the other's words, still smiled. "Yes, what a pot it will be." End of section 10. Section 11 of The Seen and the Unseen by Richard Marsh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sonia. 5. The Tipster. An Impossible Story. 3. "Yes, what a pot it will be." The words were still ringing in Mr. Major's ears when, on the morrow, he went down by train to that suburban race course. He had not carried out Mr. Gill's advice to the bitter end. He had not stolen, but he had begged and borrowed. He had applied for help in as many quarters as he could manage in the limited time at his disposal. He had told some tall tales to get it, too. He had pledged his credit to the straining point. He had in his pockets a sum of money which for him was fabulous. If he lost it, he would be without a farthing in the world, almost without the hope of one. He was quite aware that he was mad, that was the joke of it. No one knew better than he that for a man who knew nothing of horses to go punting on the turf was an act of simple insanity. Nor did he suppose that the position was improved by the fact that he was about to back the fancies of an avowed humbug who, he himself believed, was at least half imbecile. Yet he never hesitated for a moment to carry out what he knew to be the folly in his brain. The train was crowded, by that fragrant crowd which travels to a London racecourse even in the specials. The conversation was horsey. Tips were freely offered. Mr. Major heard the chances of the animals, whose names he had written on the back of an old envelope, canvassed by persons who were without doubt much better judges of a horse than he. He paid not the slightest heed. All through the din of conversation Mr. Gill's words were ringing in his ears. What a pot it will be. And wherever he looked he saw, as in a waking dream, a woman's face. This young man was simply mad. The most amazing nonsense was whirling in his head. Win a fortune, he'd win her. The two ideas were surging through his head in a sort of chime. He loved the woman. With a sort of honest pride he told himself how earnestly he loved her. He'd make his pile, and tell of his love. And to make his pile he had begged, and borrowed, and lied, all on the strength of an old fool's yarning. "Would you like a tip, sir, for the first race, sir? I'll give you a certainty, sir, for a shilling. I'd put it on myself if I had it, sir, so help me, I would." This was the greeting which he received as he alighted from the train from an individual who evidently thought that he was green. When he reached the course he made straight for the ring, and for a Leviathan penciller, whom, strangely enough, he knew by sight as well as by name. No welcher for him. What price Ladybird for the Blenheim plate? He had never made a bet in his life before, but he had a sort of dim idea that when you did bet, that was the way to set about it. "Lay you 3-1. Put me on £400. Over £100 of that 400 were his own savings, for he was beginning to keep his head above water in the artistic world, but how he got the rest of it was a sorry tale. "Lay you 7-2, sir," interposed a lay you the odds gentleman close by. "I lay you 7-2, observed the Leviathan calmly. "What name, sir? Mr. Blades, give the gentleman his ticket." The £400 were handed over. Mr. Major received in exchange a slip of pasteboard. Someone spoke to him as he turned away, this time not a betting man, someone who had apparently been looking on. "Jacobs has done you over that bet of yours.
He has given you nothing like the proper odds. Anyone, including himself, would have given you 5-1.
Mr. Major said nothing, not even to thank the speaker for the information. He took up a position to view the race. It was a fine day. Although it was probable that a crowd would come, it had not come yet. He had no difficulty in finding a favourable point of vantage from which to view the race on which he had staked more than all the money he had in the world. To show what sort of sportsman this young man was, one need only mention that he had not even purchased a card. He did not know which was Ladybird. He was not acquainted with the colours she carried. He did not know who her owner was, nor her jockey. As a plain statement of fact, he did not know if she was running in the race at all. He saw the start. He saw the animals rush by. He did not see, but he knew that the race was over. He heard the roar of voices. He turned to a man beside him. "What's won?" "Some flowery outsider." He turned to a friend. "What is it, Jim?" "I don't know." There was a short pause. "There's the number. Ladybird. Who the something's Ladybird?" Mr. Major went down to Mr. Jacobs in the ring. That dignitary greeted him with a nod. "You were in the know, Mr. Major. Mr. Blades, give Mr. Major £1,800. Would you like to do anything on the next race, Mr. Major?" Mr. Major counted over his £1,800. Taking out an old envelope from the inner pocket of his coat, he quietly referred to something which was written on the back of it. "Gent's got it all written down, Jake," observed a ribald, and a rival, penciller. Mr. Jacobs paid no heed to him. "What price King Bruce for the Windsor Stakes?" inquired Mr. Major. "Lay you 10-3, mister," yelled one gentleman. "Lay you 11-3, bawled another. Indeed, there was quite a chorus of offers. Mr. Major was indifferent to all of them. "What price will you give me, Jacobs?" "King Bruce?" The Leviathan regarded Mr. Major with a curious glance. "Well, Mr. Major, I'll give you 11-3. "Put me on £1,800. There was a slight pause of astonishment. "Who is he?" Mr. Major heard someone behind him ask. "Another Juggins?" The response was at least as audible as the inquiry had been. There was a laugh. Even Mr. Jacobs seemed amused. £1,800, 11-3, King Bruce, Mr. Major. Give Mr. Major his ticket, Mr. Blades." "Look out, Jacobs," shouted a voice. "The young gent means having you." There was another laugh at this. Mr. Major, serenely indifferent, walked away with Mr. Jacobs' ticket in his pocket. "Kyard, sir? Cracked kyard, sir?" Someone thrust something beneath his nose. Then, for the first time, Mr. Major became conscious that he was without that convenience, especially for a novice, a programme of the day. He purchased a card. He found that for the Windsor Stakes there were 5 runners. King Bruce's colours were light blue. He picked them out when the horses were making ready for starting. As the animals tore past, it seemed to him that the one with the light blue jockey on his back was bringing up the rear. It continued in the rear during the few moments in which the proceedings were in sight. Suddenly there arose a tumult of many voices. "By, he's won!" The race was over. A man at his side, who had been following it through a pair of glasses, lowered them with a full-mouthed execration. "Who's won?" "King Bruce." Mr. Major was conscious of a little fluttering in the region of his chest, as though a pulse had all at once been set vibrating. The people were rushing off in all directions. For a moment he stood still. He studied an old envelope, which he took from his pocket. Then he started for the ring. Mr. Jacobs received him effusively. "You are in luck, Mr. Major. You must have had some private information. I shall hardly like to bet with you. How much is it, Mr. Major? Mind you let me down easy." The artist handed in his brief. "What do you make it, Mr. Blades? 8,400? Is that it, Mr. Major? Why, I shouldn't have so much money in the world if it hadn't been that some other gentlemen have been paying me. I tell you something in confidence.
You're the only gentleman I know who was on King Bruce. What are you going to do on the next race, Mr. Major? Back another winner?"
What price Sweet Violet for the maiden plate?" Mr. Jacobs paused. He sucked the point of his pencil. The usual chorus broke out on either side of him. "I lay you 2-1, sir." Mr. Jacobs spoke. "Well, Mr. Major, it's my business to lay against horses at the market odds. I'll give you 7-3, though I'm not quite sure that I am doing the proper thing, you know." "How much? The lot?" Mr. Major held out to him the handful of bank notes which he had just received. "I don't know, Mr. Major, if you think I've brought the Bank of England out with me, because I haven't. So if I run a little short, and you do seem as though you were going to bleed me, perhaps you wouldn't mind taking my cheque? You'll find it good enough." "I shall be delighted." The bet was made. Sweet Violet won easily, was the general verdict, though as to that Mr. Major knew nothing. He saw the number go up upon the telegraph, and that was all he knew about it. He received back his £8,400, and an open cheque to boot. The figures upon that cheque seemed to dance before his eyes. But as he handed over that cheque, Mr. Jacobs' mood seemed to be by no means effusive. "That's enough for me, Mr. Major, for to day. I'm going to take 2 backing horses for a change." Whether Mr. Jacobs meant what he said or not, at any rate he declined to have anything more to do with Mr. Major. "You're too clever for me," he declared. The artist had to seek a market elsewhere. Not that it took him long to find one. Offers to deal rained on him from every side. "Deal with me. I'm George Foote, Mr. Major." Mr. Major knew the name, through the sporting prints. "I'll cash Mr. Jacobs' cheque. Though, mind you, I shouldn't be surprised if it was a stoomer. This is the shop for cheques. What's your fancy, Mr. Major?" "What price Devil's Own for the Churchill Handicap?" "I'll give you 7-4, and I'll go you for Mr. Jacobs' cheque." "Why," shouted a voice in the crowd, "just now you were giving 6-1." "Very well, Mr. Major, you deal with that gentleman over there. He'll lay you 6-1, in pennies. 7-4's my price." "I want to go for more than the cheque." "The cheque's big enough for me." "What's the size of it? 19,600? Yes, that's quite big enough for me." Another penciller addressed himself to Mr. Major. "How much more do you want to do?" 8,500. "I'll do it at George Foote's price. You know me, I dare say, Tom Granger, of Nottingham. Granger, with an I." Directly the artist had made his bet, Devil's Own seemed to be in general demand. "Mr. Major! You here?" As Mr. Major was thrusting Mr. Granger's ticket into his pocket, someone addressed him from behind. Turning, there was Miss Davidson. His heart seemed suddenly to cease to beat. "You?" was all that he could gasp. She laughed. "I did not know that you were a racing man. Allow me to introduce you to Sir Gerald Mason." Mr. Major was conscious that a resplendent middle-aged gentleman was acting as the lady's escort. "Are you alone?" Mr. Major explained stammeringly that he was. Half unconsciously he fell in by the lady's side. The three threaded their way among the crowd. They reached the drag. "I dare say we can find a place for you, if it's only standing room." Presently Mr. Major found himself with other ladies and gentlemen on top of a 4-in-hand. "Well, have you won?" inquired Miss Davidson, who seemed to have taken him under her wing. "Yes." There was a choking in the artist's throat. "Nearly £30,000." "What?" The artist found himself greeted with a general stare. "Nearly £30,000." "To day?" "Yes, all of it to day." Sir Gerald Mason seemed to be particularly struck. "That's a tidy little trifle," he observed. Another gentleman came clambering on to the roof. "I can't make it out. There's something up. Just now they were laying anything against Devil's Own. Now they want 3-1 on." "I expect," said Mr. Major, "it's because of me." "Because of you?" The newcomer stared. Oh, I've just been backing him for nearly £30,000. The deuce you have! He's sure to win. Is he indeed? May I ask how you know it? A person with whom I am acquainted gave me yesterday the names of all to-day's winners. Devil's Own is one of them. I have them here." Mr. Major took out an old, soiled envelope. There was something written in pencil on the back of it. He held it out in front of him. There was a universal smile. The artist was aware of it. "I came out this morning with £400. I have backed 3 of the horses whose names are on this envelope. I have already won nearly £30,000. I have placed it all upon Devil's Own. Devil's Own will win. All the horses whose names are on this envelope will win. I am sure of it." In his voice there was a ring of enthusiastic conviction. His eyes met Miss Davidson's. She smiled at him. "I hope they will, for your sake." "Thank you. I knew you would." He held out his hand to her. She gave him hers, blushing as she did so. The other people on the drag glanced at one another. When Miss Davidson withdrew her hand, she turned to the course. "We shall soon know if your prediction is true. They are starting." They were starting, though they did not start just then. Racehorses are not to be induced to start by clockwork. But at last the flag was dropped. The runners came flying down the course. "George!" exclaimed Sir Gerald Mason. "It's a procession." A horse had run off with the lead. He not only kept it, but increased it as he went. The race was finished. "A walk over for Devil's Own," remarked the gentleman who at last clambered on to the coach. He turned to Mr. Major. "I should like, sir, to know your friend." "How much have you won, Mr. Major?" The inquiry came from Miss Davidson. Mr. Major glanced at his couple of pasteboards. "I have 8,400 on with one man and 19,600 with another. That's £28,000. At 7 to 4, that's £49,000. Someone so far forgot good manners as to whistle. It was the gentleman who had clambered on to the coach. Mr. Major's glance sought Miss Davidson's. Her eyes were gleaming. "All won? I congratulate you." "Really?" "With all my heart." His cheeks were flushed. His eyes were gleaming too. Words seemed trembling on his tongue. Before he could utter them he was assailed with a question. "What's going to win the next?" It came in half a dozen voices. He glanced at the back of the envelope. "Estrella will win the Visitors' Plate." "Estrella? She'll never stay the course. And she's nowhere in the betting." "As for being nowhere in the betting, all the better for small punters like myself," remarked the elderly Sir Gerald. He descended to the ground. The others seemed to be all talking together. Mr. Major and Miss Davidson for the moment were unnoticed. "What are you going to do? You're not going to do any more betting." "I am. I am going to put every penny upon Estrella." "Oh, Mr. Major!" "Miss Davidson, I know that I shall win." "You seem very confident, but you know you cannot always have good fortune, and you are playing for high stakes, you must remember." "I am. For the highest possible. I am playing for the greatest prize in the world." His earnestness seemed to abash her. "Whatever it is, I hope you will win it." "You mean it?" She turned away. "Of course I do." He hesitated. He seemed about to speak. Then, with a sudden impulse, he too descended to the ground. "Put on £5 for me," she said to him as he went down. "I'll back your luck." He looked up at her, his face peony red. But he was speechless. His entry into the ring was greeted with something like applause. Already he was famous. In his mastering excitement he did not notice it. "Hullo, Mr. Major!" cried Mr. Granger of Nottingham. "Don't you think you're knocking 'em? Are you going for the gloves? Do you want to break the lot of us? We've all got wives and children, and we don't want to see 'em in the workhouse. What's the next article, Mr. Major?" "What price Estrella for the Visitors' Plate?" For a moment it seemed that there was no price. Then Mr. Granger made a bid. "I'll do you at evens, but not for £1 million, you know."
I won't do you at any price," said Mr. Foote, who seemed unhappy. "I'll say with Mr. Jacobs, Mr. Major's too clever for me." Sir Gerald Mason was standing by the artist's side. "Evens!" he exclaimed. "Why, Estrella's quoted at 40-1." "Oh, that was before Mr. Major was on. Mr. Major's hand in glove with the old gentleman. He's got the key of the stable." Mr. Jacobs interposed. "Look here, mister, I don't know who you are, but you've got £28,000 of my money. Go you double or quits. Evens against Estrella." "I'll come in with you, Jacobs," cried an enterprising gentleman, whose name was Johnson, that well-known patron of the fancy. "I'll do you the same price in any sum you choose, Mr. Major. 1,000,000 if you like. I think I'm good for it." Mr. Major had to be content with the terms. "I haven't done very well for you, Miss Davidson," he explained when he returned to the drag. "I've only got evens." "It's a robbery," declared the elderly Sir Gerald. "Rank robbery." "Rather too barefaced robbery for me." Thus Mr. Wilmot, which was the name of the gentleman who had clambered last on to the drag. "I don't think this time your friend has done you a good turn, Mr. Major. From her form, Estrella hasn't a ghost of a chance. Personally, I should say the odds against her were more than 40-1." "By Jove!" exclaimed a ruddy-faced young gentleman with a pane of glass in his eye. "I hope she will win. I've a monkey on her." "Not to mention my £5," laughed Miss Davidson. "Your money is quite safe. Estrella will win. I know it." "Excuse me, Mr. Major," said Mr. Wilmot, "but your tone would almost suggest that you had been getting at somebody or something on a very extensive scale. You seem cocksure." "I am cocksure." "They're off." They were. Mr. Wilmot's glasses followed the race. "A capital start. Bedgown's leading. Canute second. Hollo, the squire's coming. Estrella's nowhere. The squire's in front. What's that slipped through? Patience? Patience is coming. Come on, Patience. The squire is racing her. Where's your Estrella, Mr. Major? She don't seem to be in this race." "Patience is ahead. Bravo, Patience. By George, Canute's coming. He's in front. He's running away from 'em. Just look how he's going. It's all over. Canute for 1,000,000. Hollo! How about your Estrella, Mr. Major?" "What's that? What's that in blue and pink? It's Estrella. Dashed if she isn't coming on. Hang me if she isn't. My eyes, how she's travelling. If there's time she'll overhaul the leader. She has. She's collared him. She's racing him. She's passed him. Gosh! She's won. I've won over £150,000. With one accord they turned to Mr. Major. He seemed in a sort of ecstasy. He repeated the words. "I've won over £150,000. I knew Estrella would win." Mr. Wilmot looked a little white. "It's uncommonly queer," he said. "It is queer. I know it's queer. But I knew she'd win." Miss Davidson spoke. "I congratulate you, Mr. Major, with all my heart. I never knew anyone who won £150,000 before, and in a single day. I shall win more before I've finished. You are surely not going to tempt fortune again?" "No, not fortune. The man who gave me the names of the horses which I have here was inspired. It was given to him to see behind the veil. I half suspected it at the time. I see it clearly now. It is not fortune I am tempting. I am betting upon certainties. I know that every horse he gave me is sure to win." The people looked at one another. They were apparently in doubt as to whether this young gentleman was altogether sane. "What has this very remarkable friend of yours given you for the cup?" "Ballet girl." "That sounds more promising. Ballet girl's my own fancy and the favourite. But if you take my advice, Mr. Major, you'll keep out of the ring. Let me deal for you. If they know you're dealing, it'll knock the market all to pieces. You'll get no price at all." "What does it matter what price I get? What does it matter if I have to give 10-1 if I know the horse will win?" Mr. Wilmot shrugged his shoulders. Of course, if you know, there's nothing further to be said. Mr. Major found the ring in a panic. His entry was greeted with a roar of voices. "Mr. Major, you've about broke me," yelled Mr. Jacobs. Then came a volley of adjectives. "I can't make things out at all. Upon my soul, I don't know that I didn't ought to appeal to the stewards." Someone shouted in the crowd, "Pay up, Jake, and look pleasant." "I'll pay up," said Mr. Jacobs. "But as for looking pleasant—" There came more adjectives. "What are you going to do in the Hunt Cup, Mr. Major?" The inquiry came from neither Mr. Jacobs nor Mr. Granger. "What price ballet girl?" It was odd, after the previous tumult, to notice the silence with which Mr. Major's words were greeted. The completer silence still which followed them. No one made a price. "You're surely not afraid of one man? What, all the lot of you?" "Dash me!" roared Mr. Jacobs. "No man shall say that I'm afraid of him. Not if I have to go into the workhouse to morrow. I'll tell you what I'll do, Mr. Major. I'll give you the chance to make the biggest bet that was ever made in England. You've got over £150,000 there, and most of it is mine. If you like to put the lot of it on Ballet Girl, at 5 to 1 on, I'll take you." "5 to 1 on?" shouted the crowd. 5 to 1 on, vociferated Mr. Jacobs. "And that's an offer which I doubt if any other man upon this course will make you." It was not a tempting offer, but Mr. Major took it. "You're a very foolish man, sir," said Mr. Wilmot, who was standing at his elbow. "Why? I know the horse will win." "You may know, but I don't, and you've spoilt the market for other men." The start was a long time coming. While they waited for it, there was considerable excitement on the top of the drag. "Mr. Major," said Miss Davidson, "I do hope that mysterious friend of yours is right again. It will be a dreadful thing if Ballet Girl should fail us. We are all of us on her to a man." "And at such a price," growled Mr. Wilmot. "Upon my word, I am ashamed of myself when I think that I ever allowed myself to be induced to back any horse at such a figure." Mr. Major was standing by Miss Davidson. His eyes, which rested on her, were eloquent with many things. Always good looking, just then he was even curiously handsome. "Ballet Girl will win. I am sure of it. Then I shall never bet again." "Never?" "Never. I don't think I ever bet before. I never shall again." "Your luck has been fabulous, really quite incredible. If I had been you, I should have been content with what I'd won. To risk it all seems dreadful." "Why? You would be prepared to bet that 2 and 2 make 4 1,000 times in succession?" "But that is different." "Not at all. Just as certainly as you know that 2 and 2 make 4, I know that Ballet Girl will win. I shall have made my fortune. I shall have only one thing left to win. Only one." Someone said they were getting ready to start. All eyes were turned towards the course. Mr. Wilmot's glasses again came into play. "Isn't that Tragedy Queen who won't stand still? Up go her heels. Now there's Chappie joining her." Mr. Major, under cover of the gathering excitement, half whispered to Miss Davidson, "I shall have only one thing left to win." "I hope you will win it, whatever it is." She faced him. "Mr. Major, I do hope Ballet Girl will win." "I know she will." "They're off." They were. Mr. Wilmot favoured them with a running commentary. "A good start. What's that in the black and white hoops in front? Hollo! Chappie's making the pace. Tragedy Queen seems to be funking it. Or is young Blades holding her in? Ballet Girl seems to be running third. White will get himself shut in if he doesn't look out. Hollo! Chappie's ahead. Mark Antony's challenging him. They're making a ding-dong thing of it, by George. Ballet Girl's creeping up. So is Tragedy Queen. What is that in the black and white hoops? Isn't it bar 1? It is bar 1. Ballet Girl is coming on. By God, she is. Hark at the people shouting. Our 5-to-1 chance looks rosy, Mr. Major. She's collared chappy. Tragedy Queen is sticking to her. It strikes me it's going to be a race between the pair of them. Bar one's third. Isn't Ballet Girl just flying? Bravo! Why, there must be 2 lengths between her and Tragedy Queen. Hark at the people. I say, Mr. Major, the devil must be in that friend of yours. Ballet Girl's half a dozen lengths in front. She's having a lark with them. Why, what is that? She's down. Down! My God, why don't White pick her up? There's something wrong. Tragedy Queen's past her. So's bar one. Bar one's gaining. Bar one's in front. Mr. Wilmot must have forgotten the presence of ladies, and in that hot moment it is not impossible that his forgetfulness was overlooked. Bar one's won. He turned on Mr. Major. Bar one has won. There was a hubbub of many voices, a wild rush of people on to the course, where Ballet Girl lay motionless. Her last race was run. The flush had faded from Mr. Major's cheeks, the light from his eyes. I have lost it all. He turned to Miss Davidson. You won't let it make any difference? Make any difference? I did it all for you. I did not like to come to you with empty hands. Mr. Major, what do you mean? Although I loved you so, I did not like to think that you were rich and I was poor. If I had won, I should have given it all to you. It would have been for you that it was won. The lady turned away. It almost seemed that this remarkable young gentleman was making a declaration of affection in public on the roof of a drag, right before the eyes, the ears, of a number of amazed and bewildered strangers. You won't let it make any difference because I have lost? The lady favoured him with a front view. Her cheeks were a flaming red. But in spite of it, she was the more self-possessed of the two. I think, Mr. Major, that excitement has turned your brain. It is rather a singular place in which to volunteer such a statement, but I don't know if you are aware that I am engaged to be married to Mr. Philip Cumberland." "Engaged? To Mr. Cumberland?" It was piteous to see the young man's face. "But he's in Oban." "I don't know how you know he is in Oban, nor do I see why his being in Oban should make any difference to the fact of our engagement." "But why did you buy my picture?" "My good sir, I have never bought any picture of yours." "Gill said it was you." "You seem to be favoured with some curious friends. I have not the honour of Mr. Gill's acquaintance. Had I purchased your picture, I do not see how the purchase would have warranted your peculiar behaviour. As a matter of fact, I have done nothing of the kind." Mr. Wilmot slipped his arm through Mr. Major's. "Come, my friend, I think you and I had better take a stroll together. You seem to have let us in for a very nice thing." End of section 11. Section 12 of The Seen and the Unseen by Richard Marsh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sonia. 5. The Tipster. An Impossible Story. 4. "Gill!" Mr. Major knocked at the door again. "Gill!" There was still no answer. He turned the handle. The door was open. Mr. Major entered. The lamp was still unlighted, but he could see that Mr. Gill was seated at the table. "Gill!" Mr. Gill continued silent. Mr. Major went and touched him on the shoulder. "Gill!" He started back. Mr. Gill was dead. "Starvation, that's what it is." Thus spoke the landlady, hastily summoned to the presence of the newly dead. "Starvation!" The young man turned his ghastly face to the woman's. "Starvation. He's been slowly starving this ever so long. I don't believe he's tasted a morsel of meat these last 2 weeks. He owed me 7 weeks' rent, but he was such an old lodger I didn't like to be hard on him.
Now I suppose I shall lose it all." "But I thought he had so many clients." "Not one. He used to have when first I knew him, but they turned him up long ago. I don't believe he ever named a winner in his life. I know more than once he put me on a wrong one. Of late things have been preying on his mind. It's my belief that for nearly a week now he's been quite cracked." Mr. Major wondered. End of section 12. Section 13 of The Seen and the Unseen by Richard Marsh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sonia. 6. The 15th Man. The Story of a Rugby Match. It was not until we were actually in the field, and were about to begin to play, that I learned that the Brixham men had come one short. It seemed that one of their men had been playing in a match the week before, in a hard frost, if you please, and getting pitched on to his head, had broken his skull nearly into 2 clean halves. That is the worst of playing in a frost. You are nearly sure to come to grief. Not to ordinary grief either, but a regular cracker. It was hard lines on the Brixham team. Some men always are getting themselves smashed to pieces just as a big match is due. The man's name was Joyce, Frank Joyce. He played half-back for Brixham, and for the county too, so you may be sure Lance didn't care to lose him. Still, they couldn't go and drag the man out of the hospital with a hole in his head big enough to put your fist into. They had tried to get a man to take his place, but at the last moment the substitute had failed to show. "If we can't beat them, 15 to their 14, I think we'd better go in for challenging girls' schools. Last year they beat us, but this year, as we've one man to the good, perhaps we might manage to pull it off." That's how Mason talked to us, as if we wanted them to win. Although they were only 14 men, they could play. I don't think I ever saw a team who was stronger in their forwards. Lance, their captain, kicked off. Mason, our chief, returned. Then one of their men, getting the leather, tried a run. We downed him, a scrimmage was formed. Then, before we knew it, they were rushing the ball across the field. When it did show, I was on it like a flash. I passed to Mason, but he was collared almost before he had a chance to start. There was another turn at scrimmaging, and lively work it was, especially for us who had the pleasure of looking on. So when again I got a sight of it, I didn't lose much time. I had it up, and I was off. I didn't pass. I tried a run upon my own account. I thought that I was clear away. I had passed the forwards. I thought that I had passed the field when, suddenly, someone sprang at me, out of the fog. It was a little thick, you know. Caught me round the waist, lifted me off my feet, and dropped me on my back. That spoiled it. Before I had a chance of passing they were all on top of me, and again the ball was in the scrimmage. When I returned to my place behind, I looked to see who it was had collared me. The fellow, I told myself, was one of their half-backs. Yet when I looked at their halves, I couldn't make up my mind which of them it was. Try how we could, although we had the best of the play, we couldn't get across their line. Although, I say it, we all put in some first-rate work. We never played better in our lives. We all had run after run. The passing was as accurate as if it had been mechanical, and yet we could not do the trick. Time after time, just as we were almost in, one of their men put a stop to our little game and spoiled us. The funny part of the business was that, either owing to the fog or to our stupidity, we could not make up our minds which of their men it was. At last I spotted him. Mason had been held nearly on their goal line. They were playing their usual game of driving us back in the scrimmage, when the ball broke through. I took it. I passed to Mason. I thought he was behind when he was collared and thrown. "Joyce!" I cried. "Why, I thought that you weren't playing." "What are you talking about?" asked one of their men. "Joyce isn't playing." I stared. "Not playing? Why, it was he who collared Mason." "Stuff!" I did not think the man was particularly civil. It was certainly an odd mistake which I had made. I was just behind Mason when he was collared, and I saw the face of the man who collared him. I could have sworn it was Frank Joyce. "Who was that who downed you just now?" I asked of Mason, directly I had the chance. "Their half-back?" Their half-back. Their halves were Tom Wilson and Granger. How could I have mistaken either of them for Joyce? A little later Giffard was puzzled. "One of their fellows plays a thundering good game, but do you know, I can't make out which one of them it is." "Do you mean the fellow who keeps collaring?" "That's the man." The curious part of it was that I never saw the man except when he was collaring. "The next time," said Giffard, when for about the sixth time he had been on the point of scoring, "if I don't get in, I'll know the reason why. I'll kill that man." It was all very well to talk about our killing him. It looked very much more like his killing us. Mason passed the word that if there was anything like a chance we were to drop. The chance came immediately afterwards. They muffed somehow in trying to pass. Blaine got the leather. He started to run. "Drop!" yelled Mason. In that fog, and from where Blaine was, dropping a goal was out of the question. He tried the next best thing. He tried to drop into touch. But the attempt was a failure. The kick was a bad one, the ball was as heavy as lead, so that there was not much kick in it, and as it was coming down, one of their men, appearing right on the spot, caught it, dropped the drop, which was a drop, sent the ball right over our heads, and as near as a toucher over the bar. Just then the whistle sounded. "Do you know," declared Ingall as we were crossing over, "I believe they're playing 15 men." Mason scoffed. "Do you think without giving us notice they would play 15 when they told us they were only playing 14?" "Hanged if I don't count them," persisted Ingall. He did, and we all did. We faced round and reckoned them up. There were only 14, unless one was slinking out of sight somewhere in the dim recesses of the fog. Which seemed scarcely probable. Still Ingall seemed dissatisfied. "They're playing 4¾ whispered Giffard when the game restarted. So they were. Wheeler, Pendleton, Marshall, and another. Who the fourth man was I couldn't make out. He was a big strapping fellow, I could see that, but the play was so fast that more than that I couldn't see. "Who is the fourth man?" "Don't know. Can't see his face. It's so confoundedly foggy." It was foggy, but still, of course, it was not foggy enough to render a man's features indistinguishable at the distance of only a few feet. All the same, somehow or other he managed to keep his face concealed from us. While Giffard and I had been whispering, they had been packing in. The ball broke out our side. I had it. I tried to run. Instantly I saw that fourth 3/4 rush at me. As he came I saw his face. I was so amazed that I stopped dead. Putting his arms about me, he held me as in a vice. "Joyce!" I cried. Before the word was out of my mouth, half a dozen of their men had hold of the ball. "Held! Held!" they screamed. "Down!" I gasped. And it was down, with 2 or 3 of their men on top of me. They were packing the scrimmage before I had time to get fairly on my feet again. "That was Joyce who collared me!" I exclaimed. Pack in!" shouted Mason from behind. And they did pack in with a vengeance. Giffard had the ball. They were down on him. It was hammer and tongs. But through it all we stuck to the leather. They downed us, but not before we had passed it to a friend. Out of it came Giffard, sailing along as though he had not been swallowing mud in pailfuls. I thought he was clear, but no. He stopped short and dropped the ball. Dropped it, as he stood there, from his 2 hands as though he were a baby. They asked no questions. They had it up. They were off with it as though they meant to carry it home. They carried it, too, all the way — almost. It was in disagreeable propinquity to our goal by the time that it was held. "Now then, Brixham, you've got it!" That was what they cried. "Staining! Staining! All together!" That was what we answered. But though we did work all together, it was as much as we could manage. "Where's Giffard?" bellowed Mason. My impression was that he had remained like a signpost rooted to the ground. I had seen him standing motionless after he had dropped the ball, and even as the Brixham man rushed past him. But just then he put in an appearance. " I protest !" he cried. "What about?" asked Mason. "What do they mean by pretending they're not playing Frank Joyce when all the time they are?" "Oh, confound Frank Joyce! Play up, do! You've done your best to give them the game already. Steady, Steyning, steady! Left there, left! Centre, steady!" We were steady. We were more than steady. Steadiness alone would not have saved us. We all played forward. At last, somehow, we got the ball back into something like the middle of the field. Giffard kept whispering to me all the time, even in the hottest of the rush. "What lies pretending that they're not playing Joyce?" Here he had a discussion with the ball, mostly on his knees. "Humbug about his being in the hospital." We had another chance. Out of the turmoil, Mason was flying off with a lead. It was the first clear start he had that day. When he has got that, it is catch him who catch can. As he pelted off, the fog, which kept coming and going, all at once grew thicker. He had passed all their men. Of ours, I was the nearest to him. It looked all the world to a china orange that we were going to score at last, when, to my disgust, he reeled, seemed to give a sort of spring, and then fell right over on to his back. I did not understand how he had managed to do it, but I supposed that he had slipped in the mud. Before I could get within passing distance, the Brixham men were on us, and the ball was down. "I thought you'd done it that time." I said this to him as the scrimmage was being formed. He did not answer. He stood looking about him in a hazy sort of way, as though the further proceedings had no interest for him. "What's the matter? Are you hurt?" He turned to me. "Where is he?" he asked. "Where's who?" I couldn't make him out. There was quite a curious look upon his face. "Joyce." Somehow, as he said this, I felt a trifle queer. It was his face, or his tone, or something. "Didn't you see him throw me?" I didn't know what he meant. But before I could say so we had another little rough and tumble. One go up and the other go down. A hubbub arose. There was Ingall shouting. "I protest, I don't think this sort of thing's fair play." "What sort of thing?" "You said you weren't playing Joyce." "Said we weren't? We aren't." "Why, he just took the ball out of my hands. Joyce, where are you?" "Yes, where is he?" Then they laughed. Mason intervened. "Excuse me, Lance, we've no objection to your playing Joyce, but why do you say you aren't?" "I don't think you're well. I tell you that Frank Joyce is at this moment lying in Brixham Hospital." "He just now collared me." I confess that when Mason said that I was a trifle staggered. I had distinctly seen that he had slipped and fallen. No one had been within a dozen yards of him at the time. Those Brixham men told him so, not too civilly. "Do you fellows mean to say," he roared, "that Frank Joyce didn't just now pick me up and throw me?" I struck in. "I mean to say so. You slipped and fell. My dear fellow, no one was near you at the time." He sprang round at me. "Well, that beats anything." "At the same time," I added, "it's all nonsense to talk about Joyce being in Brixham Hospital, because since half time at any rate he's been playing 3/4." "Of course he has!" cried Ingall. "Didn't I see him?" "And didn't he collar me?" asked Giffard. The Brixham men were silent. We looked at them, and they at us. "You fellows are dreaming," said Lance. "It strikes me that you don't know Joyce when you see him." "That's good," I cried, "considering that he and I were 5 years at school together." "Suppose you point him out, then." "Joyce!" I shouted. "You aren't ashamed to show your face, I hope." "Joyce!" they replied in mockery. "You aren't bashful, Joyce?" He was not there. Or we couldn't find him, at any rate. We scrutinized each member of the team. It was really absurd to suppose that I could mistake any of them for Joyce. There was not the slightest likeness. Dryall appealed to the referee. "Are you sure nobody sneaked off the field?" "Stuff!" he said. "I've been following the game all the time, and know every man who's playing, and Joyce hasn't been upon the ground." As for his playing 3/4, Pendleton, Marshall, and I have been playing 3/4 all the afternoon.
and I don't think that either of us is very much like Joyce." This was Tom Wilson. "You've been playing 4¾ since we crossed over." "Bosh!" said Wilson. That was good, as though I hadn't seen the 4 with my own eyes. "Play!" sang out the referee. "Don't waste any more time." We were at it again. We might be mystified. There was something about the whole affair which was certainly mysterious to me, but we did not intend to be beaten. "They're only playing 3¾ now," said Giffard. So they were. That was plain enough. I wondered if the fourth man had joined the forwards. But why should they conceal the fact that they had been playing 4? One of their men tried a drop. Mason caught it, ran, was collared, passed, wide to the left, and I was off. The whole crowd was in the centre of the field. I put on the steam. Lance came at me. I dodged. He missed. Pendleton was bearing down upon me from the right. I outpaced him. I got a lead. Only Rivers, their back, was between the Brixham goal and me. He slipped just as he made his effort. I was past. It was only a dozen yards to the goal. Nothing would stop me now. I was telling myself that the only thing left was the shouting, when right in front of me stood — Joyce. Where he came from I have not the least idea. Out of nothing, it seemed to me. He stood there, cool as a cucumber, waiting, as it appeared, until I came within his reach. His sudden appearance balked me. I stumbled. The ball slipped from beneath my arm. I saw him smile. Forgetting all about the ball, I made a dash at him. The instant I did so he was gone. I felt a trifle mixed. I heard behind me the roar of voices. I knew that I had lost my chance. But at the moment that was not the trouble. Where had Joyce come from? Where had he gone? "Now then, Steyning, all together, and you'll do it!" I heard Mason's voice ring out above the hubbub. "Brixham, Brixham!" shouted Lance. "Play up!" Joyce or no Joyce, I told myself, hang me if I won't do it yet. I got on side. Blaine had hold of the leather. They were on him like a cartload of bricks. He passed to Giffard. "Don't run back!" I screamed. They drove him back. He passed to me. They were on the ball as soon as I was. They sent me spinning. Somebody got hold of it. Just as he was off, I made a grab at his leg. He went down on his face. The ball broke loose. I got onto my feet. They were indulging in what looked to me very much like hacking. We sent the leather through, and Lance was off. Their fellows backed him up in style. They kept us off until he had a start. He bore off to the right. Already he had shaken off our forwards. I saw Mason charge him. I saw that he sent Mason flying. I made for him. I caught him round the waist. He passed to Pendleton. Pendleton was downed. He lost the ball. Back it came to me, and I was off. I was away before most of them knew what had become of the leather. Again there was only Rivers between the goal and me. He soon was out of the reckoning. The mud beat him. As he was making for me, down he came upon his hands and knees. I had been running wide till then. When he came to grief, I centred. Should I take the leather in, or drop? "Drop!" shouted a voice behind. That settled me. I was within easy range of the goal. I ought to manage the kick. I dropped. At least, I tried to. It was only a try, because, just as I had my toe against the ball, and was in the very act of kicking, Joyce stood right in front of me. He stood so close that, so to speak, he stood right on the ball. It fell dead. It didn't travel an inch. As I made my fruitless effort, and was still poised upon one leg, placing his hand against my chest, he pushed me over, backwards. As I fell I saw him smile, just as I had seen him smile when he had baulked me just before. I didn't feel like smiling. I felt still less like smiling when, as I yet lay sprawling, Rivers, pouncing on the ball, dropped it back into the centre of the field. He was still standing by me when I regained my feet. He volunteered an observation. "Lucky for us you muffed that kick." "Where's Joyce?" I asked. "Where's who?" "Joyce." He stared at me. "I don't know what you're driving at. I think you fellows must have got Joyce on the brain." He returned to his place in the field. I returned to mine. I had an affectionate greeting from Giffard. That's the second chance you've thrown away. Whatever made you muff that kick?" "Giffard," I asked, "do you think I'm going mad?" "I should think you've gone." I could not — it seems ridiculous, but I could not ask if he had seen Joyce. It was so evident that he had not And yet, if I had seen him, he must have seen him too. As he suggested, I must have gone mad. The play was getting pretty rough, the ground was getting pretty heavy. We had churned it into a regular quagmire. Sometimes we went above the ankle in liquid mud. As for the state that we were in — One of theirs had the ball. Half a dozen of ours had hold of him. "Held! Held!" they yelled. "It's not held!" he gasped. They had him down and sat on him. Then he owned that it was held. "Let it through!" cried Mason when the leather was in scrimmage. Before our forwards had a chance they rushed it through. We picked it up. We carried it back. They rushed it through again. The tide of battle swayed, now to this side, now to that. Still we gained. 2 or 3 short runs bore the ball within punting distance of their goal. We more than retained the advantage. Yard by yard we drove them back. It was a match against time. We looked like winning if there was only time enough. At last it seemed as though matters had approached something very like a settlement. Pendleton had the ball. Our men were on to him. To avoid being held, he punted. But he was charged before he really had a chance. The punt was muddled. It was a catch for Mason. He made his mark. Within 20 yards of their goal. There is no better drop kick in England than Alec Mason. If from a free kick at that distance he couldn't top their bar, we might as well go home to bed. Mason took his time. He judged the distance with his eye. Then, paying no attention to the Brixham forward, who had stood up to his mark, he dropped a good 6 feet on his own side of it. There was an instant's silence. Then they raised a yell. For as the ball left Mason's foot, one of their men sprang at him, and, leaping upwards, caught the ball in the air. It was wonderfully done. Quick as lightning, before we had recovered from our surprise, he had dropped the ball back into the centre of the field. "Now then, Brixham!" bellowed Lance. And they came rushing on. They came on, too. We were so disconcerted by Mason's total failure that they got the drop on us. They reached the ladder before our back had time to return. It was all we could do to get upon the scene of action quickly enough to prevent their having the scrimmage all to themselves. Mason's collapse had put life into them as much as, for the moment, it had taken it out of us. They carried the ball through the scrimmage as though our forwards were not there. "Now then, Steyning, you're not going to let them beat us." As Mason held his peace, I took his place as fugleman. But we could not stand against them. We could not, in scrimmage or out of it. All at once they seemed to be possessed. In an instant their back play improved 100%. One of their men in particular played like old Nick himself. In the excitement — and they were an exciting 60 seconds — I could not make out which one of them it was, but he made things lively. He as good as played us single-handed. He was always on the ball. He seemed to lend their forwards irresistible impetus when it was in the scrimmage. And when it was out of it, wasn't he just upon the spot? He was ubiquitous, here, there, and everywhere. And at last he was off. Exactly how it happened is more than I can say, but I saw that he had the ball. I saw him dash away with it. I made for him. He brushed me aside as though I were a fly. I was about to start in hot pursuit when someone caught me by the arm. I turned, in a trifle of a rage. There was Mason at my side. "Never mind that fellow. Listen to me." These were funny words to come from the captain of one's team at the very crisis of the game. I both listened and looked. Something in the expression of his face quite startled me. "Do you know who it was who spoiled my kick? It was either Joyce or — Joyce's ghost." Before I was able to ask him what it was he meant, there arose a hullabaloo of shouting. I turned, just in time to see the fellow who had run away with the leather drop it, as sweetly as you please, just over our goal. They had won. And at that moment the whistle sounded. They had done it just on time. The man who had done the trick turned round and faced us. He was wearing a worsted cap, such as brewers wear. Taking it off, he waved it over his head. As he did so, there was not a man upon the field who did not see him clearly, who did not know who he was. He was Frank Joyce. He stood there for a moment before us all, and then was gone. "Lance," shouted the referee, "here's a telegram for you." Lance was standing close to Mason and to me. A telegraph boy came pelting up. Lance took the yellow envelope, which the boy held out to him. He opened it. "Why, what?" Through the mud upon his face he went white, up to the roots of his hair. He turned to us with startled eyes. "Joyce died in Brixham Hospital nearly an hour ago. The hospital people have telegraphed to say so." End of section 13. Section 14 of The Seen and the Unseen by Richard Marsh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sonia. 7. The Assassin. Chapter 1. Kennard passed the paper to Nash. "Read that," he said. Nash did as he was told. He read the advertisement to which Kennard was pointing with his finger. We give that advertisement, rendered from the original French into English. "An individual wishes to be rid of the insupportable burden of existence. For particular reasons, this individual wishes to leave behind a certain sum of money. In exchange, therefore, for a suitable amount, the advertiser will undertake to perform any deed which shall inevitably result in death. Address: Tired, 30 bis, Rue de Pékin." "Candid almost to a fault," was Willie Nash's comment. "Gerbert, what do you think of this?" Having read it, M. Gerbert shrugged his shoulders. "Well, what of it? It is nothing." "You think it is nothing?" "It is either a hoax, in which case it is plainly nothing, or it is true. And what is it then? How many people are there, do you suppose, who are tired of their lives? Look at me, for instance. Look at me. You laugh." As a matter of fact, they had exchanged glances, but the thing had not amounted to a laugh. "Very good. You English are of a different race to us French. The things which, with your coarseness, but prick you, with our delicacy, cut us to the heart. My God, yes. But that has nothing to do with the advertisement." M. Gerbert waved the paper in the air. "Here is a man who announces that he is tired of his life. That is but a commonplace. He announces that he will dispose of that of which he is tired in exchange for a certain sum. There, I grant you, is a touch of the original. So many people dispose of their lives in exchange for nothing at all. But, my friends, think of the number of persons who are willing to risk, and to do risk, their lives for twopence halfpenny, who will march to certain death for a 5-franc piece. This creature," M. Gerbert rapped his knuckle against the paper, "is possibly some bravo of a fellow who says to himself, 'I will have one good hour, and then, after that, what matters all the rest?' That is so. Won't your police have something to say to such an advertisement?" "Ah, Monsieur Nash, our police. With our police it is altogether a matter of the digestion. Good fortune." M. Gerbert rose. He drained his absinthe to the dregs. With a wave of the hand he walked away. Mr. Kennard drew the paper towards him. "I've a mind to see this through." Willie Nash looked at him askance. "The advertisement, I mean, and the advertiser too." "Are you thinking of setting him to perform a deed which shall inevitably result in death?" "It depends upon what he calls a suitable amount. I am not a rich man. I can't afford to be unduly extravagant, even for an occasional luxury." "You!" "William, I have something in my mind's eye which I should be willing to pay any man a fair price for doing. When he had done it, I don't think he'd want to do anything more. You bet." "Your humour sometimes lies so deep that, on this occasion, you must excuse me if I ask if you are joking." Mr. Kennard did not directly reply. He studied the advertisement again. "I think, by way of a preliminary, that I should like to make this gentleman's acquaintance." "Seriously?" "So seriously that I propose to write to him at once, making an appointment for to morrow. If you are at my place to morrow morning at 11, you will be able to see if he keeps it." "If you take my advice, you won't be such a fool." "No? Are you afraid of blackmailing, or what? Go to. No one wants you. Stop away." "I'll come, but you'll find he won't. As Gerbert suggested, I expect the thing's a hoax." "Yes? Probably in exchange for my letter I shall receive some valuable information about a novelty in soap." End of section 14. Section 15 of The Seen and the Unseen by Richard Marsh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sonia. 7. The Assassin. Chapter 2. "Didn't I say he wouldn't come?" "It is just upon 11. Give even an assassin a minute's grace." "Seriously, Hugh, if the fellow does come, I would strongly recommend you to be extremely careful what you say to him. You know the French have their own point of view. It's a very different point of view from ours. If you don't look out you may be in a mess before you know it. Your joke may turn out too much like earnest." "As I told you, it will depend in a measure upon what he calls a suitable amount. I can't afford to pay too much, even for murder." "You!" There was a knock at the door. "Who's that?" "It's the assassin." "Enter." The door opened. There entered a woman. They stared. They might not have been able to say what it was that they had expected, but they had not expected this. The woman was slightly built, of medium height. She was dressed in black. She wore a veil which was so thick that it obscured her features. But one guessed, from her carriage, that she was young. The two men stood up. She remained in the doorway with the handle of the open door still in her hand. "Monsieur Hugh Kennard?" Certainly the voice was a young woman's. She spoke softly and with a little tremor, as if she caught her breath. Mr. Kennard bent his head. "I am Monsieur Kennard." "And this gentleman?" The woman motioned with her hand towards Willie Nash. "This gentleman is my friend, my very good friend." The woman seemed to hesitate. The two men said nothing. They gave her not the least encouragement. At last, apparently arriving at a resolution, coming right into the room, she shut the door. "This, Monsieur Kennard, is your letter." She held out a letter which Mr. Kennard recognized as the one which he had written. "You said 11. To me the hour was a little awkward. But I am come." "To whom have I the pleasure of speaking?" asked Mr. Kennard after a pause, during which he had looked at his friend, and his friend had looked at him. "To an individual." Stepping forward, Willie Nash advanced a chair. "Permit me to offer mademoiselle a seat." He laid a stress upon the mademoiselle. She did not seem to notice it. "Thank you. I had rather stand." There was silence. She stood, seemingly at her ease, her hands at her side, eyeing Mr. Kennard through the thick folds of her veil. "Mademoiselle," he followed Mr. Nash's lead, "must forgive my observing that her description of herself as an individual is a little vague." "Monsieur understands sufficiently what that description conveys. I am the individual to whom life has become an insupportable burden." It is impossible."
"How impossible?"
"It is impossible that to mademoiselle life can already have become an insupportable burden." So far the woman's intonation had been curiously sweet, with something in it which suggested the voice of a child. Now it perceptibly changed. It became, as it were, a little caustic. "Will monsieur have the goodness to confine himself to the matter which is in hand? I am here at monsieur's particular request. What is it monsieur would wish that I should do?" "I cannot conceive that mademoiselle is in earnest."
She showed signs of impatience. "How shall I convince monsieur? Does he desire from me an oath? I am ready. If, in exchange for a particular amount, monsieur will tell me what is the task he requires from me, which shall inevitably result in death, by my actions I will quickly prove that I am in earnest, at least, so far as that."
"But surely mademoiselle must perceive that she has me at a disadvantage. She knows me by name, by sight. She would even know my private affairs, yet she will not even suffer me to see her face."
"I am but an instrument. What does it matter what an instrument looks like, so long as that which it does is done efficiently?"
"Suppose, on the other hand, that, so soon as I have shared with mademoiselle my confidences, she goes from here to the police?" The woman hesitated.
"What is the amount which monsieur is prepared to offer in exchange for the task which he requires?"
"What is the sum which mademoiselle has in her mind?"
10,000 francs."
She drew herself upright, throwing back her head with a little defiant gesture, as if the sum she named had been a superb one. The two men started. They stared at each other. Willie Nash distinctly smiled. 10,000 francs!" cried Mr. Kennard. "Is it possible that mademoiselle is willing to give her life in exchange for 10,000 francs?"
"It's not my life I give. My life is nothing, to me or to anyone. I ask 10,000 francs in exchange for the deed which you would set me to do. In other words, I desire that my death may be worth something, though my life is of no account. What is it that monsieur requires?"
"Suppose I were to require you to kill Monsieur le Président?"
For the first time she showed signs of emotion. She started, so unmistakably that she had to lean for support on the back of the chair which Willie Nash had offered her. "Kill Monsieur le Président? That would not be very pleasant."
"Does mademoiselle suppose that a deed, the doing of which would inevitably result in death, would be surrounded, as a matter of course, with all the elements of pleasantness?"
"Monsieur laughs at me. I desire that monsieur will not laugh. I am ready. If monsieur will give me his word that he will pay 10,000 francs in a certain quarter so soon as he learns that Monsieur le Président is no more, I will do what he requires." When he spoke again, Mr. Kennard's tone was even unwontedly dry.
"Am I to take it that mademoiselle is in earnest?"
She hesitated. Then with both her hands she raised her veil. "If monsieur will look at me, he will see I am in earnest." What the two men did see was that she was scarcely out of her girlhood, surely not out of her teens. She was fairer than the average French woman. Her face was broad across the cheekbones. Lower down it narrowed almost to a point at the chin. Her eyes were big and serious, the eyes of a child. Her pretty, tempting, grave little mouth was well matched with her eyes. As she said, one had but to look at her to see that she was in earnest, with the earnestness of a child. "Monsieur," in her voice there came now and then a throb which was in odd consonance with the pathos of her whole appearance, "I entreat you to believe that I am in earnest. I entreat you to believe that to me life is less than nothing, that all that is left me is to die. But I would have you to understand that I am so placed that, in dying, I would wish my death to be worth more than my life, to those who may be left behind." Tears were in her eyes. Mr. Kennard dashed across the room to her. "For goodness' sake, child, don't cry. Come, sit down and tell me all about it." "Monsieur, do not touch me." "Touch you? Why, I'm old enough to be your father, child." "Monsieur, I desire you not to touch me." She withdrew her hand from the pocket of her dress. In it she was holding a revolver. Mr. Kennard stared at her, his whole face a vivid note of exclamation. "You little firebrand!" "I was aware that in my situation I was liable to be insulted. I can assure monsieur that I am prepared. May I again ask monsieur to confine himself to the business which is in hand?" "What do you call the business which is in hand? Do you suppose—" With sudden ferocity Mr. Kennard thrust his hands into his trousers pockets. "Is it possible that you suppose that I was seriously offering you 10,000 francs to kill the President?" The contrast between the man's amazement and the girl's seriousness was, in its way, ludicrous. "What, then, is the deed which you would have me do?" "Deed I would have you do?" With both hands Mr. Kennard rumpled his hair. He turned to Willie Nash. "Nash, did you hear her? She asks me what is the deed I would have her do. As if I were the villain at the Vic, and she my ruthless minion." Although Mr. Kennard spoke to his friend in English, something in his manner seemed all at once to give the girl a glimpse of the sort of man he really was. With understanding, the tears came again into her eyes. "I perceive you have been having a jest with me. I wish you, monsieur, a good day." Before they could stop her she had gone. Willie Nash stared at the door, which he had pulled to behind her. "Stark mad," he said. Mr. Kennard looked from the door towards him. His face was still one vivid note of exclamation. "There's a method in her madness. If you were to offer her 10,000 francs, I believe she'd think as little of shooting me as if I were a spadger." Nash shrugged his shoulders. He took out his cigarette case. "I told you that the French had their point of view and we had ours." "Did you indeed? William Nash, if you only had been someone else, what a clever man you might have been." Mr. Kennard began pacing up and down, tousling his hair as he walked, first with one hand, then with the other. The minx! The chit! With a voice and a face that you'd think she was an understudy for an angel, and yet to be burning with a desire to kill herself and anybody else you like to mention. Why? What for? My boy, for less than a monkey." Mr. Nash was lighting a cigarette. "It is only," he observed, "after you have lived some time in France among the French that you begin to realize how much abroad you are." Mr. Kennard stood still to glare at him. "Sententious jackdaw!" He recommenced his walking to and fro. "I say, William, how would you like to marry her?" There was the sound of someone at the door. "Hollo! Is this her back again?" When the door opened, however, it was M. Gerbert who came in. Mr. Kennard went and laid his hands upon his shoulders. "Gerbert, I've been having an interview with the assassin." Mr. Kennard was 6'4", and M. Gerbert was about 4'6". The difference in their size was not only a question of height. Mr. Kennard was clumsily made, big and brawny. M. Gerbert's build was almost feminine. His hands and feet were as small as a woman's. He had long red hair, the ends of which strayed from under the brim of his big slouch hat. The size of the hat emphasized the diminutive proportions of its wearer. His face was white and eager, a typical French face of a certain class, all vivacity and nerves. Just now there was a look on it of painful tension, of something strained, as if a fever burned within. But then M. Gerbert was apparently, in general, such a mere bundle of nerves that one drifted in the habit of taking it for granted that all his moods were evanescent. He looked up at the Englishman towering above him. "I do not follow you." "I say that I've been having an interview with the assassin, with the individual, you remember,
who advertised that life had become an insupportable burden." "Ah!" Monsieur Gerbert slipped Mr. Kennard's hands from off his shoulders. "You wrote to him?" "I wrote to him." "Did he turn out to be the ordinary type of bravo, or merely an invertebrate animal with suicidal tendencies?" "I don't quite know what you call the ordinary type of bravo." "It is plain enough. I am myself an illustration. It is a fact that I am myself contemplating inserting a similar advertisement upon my own account." "You find life an insupportable burden?" "As for that, these many years. After one's childhood, one always wishes to make an end of it." Mr. Kennard turned to Willie Nash to stare. Taking his cigarette from between his lips, Mr. Nash addressed Monsieur Gerbert, laughing as he spoke. "So your glimpse of paradise has vanished?" "You mean Celestine, my wife? Bah! That is finished." "It was merely an entr'acte, then?" "No, it was not an entr'acte. It was a complete tragedy of the little sordid sort which at present is the fashion." Mr. Nash had resumed his cigarette. Mr. Kennard had poised himself against a corner of the table. "Gerbert, the other day you were raving about your wife as if she were something higher than the angels. Do you mean to tell me, sir, that that's all over?" "My ravings? Ah, no." Monsieur Gerbert had continued to wear his hat. Now taking it off, crushing it up with his right hand, he held it out in front of him. "I shall always have my ravings, though my wife has gone." "Gone? What the devil do you mean?" Monsieur Gerbert shrugged his shoulders. "What does it matter? Perhaps she has begun to love another, or without loving another she has simply grown tired of me, or she finds my poverty more than she can bear." "I suppose, young man, you have been clearing the matrimonial atmosphere, and this is the serio-comic fashion in which it pleases you to look at it?" Monsieur Gerbert placed himself in Mr. Kennard's largest armchair. "What sort was this fellow who found it necessary to advertise the fact that he found his life an insupportable burden?" "The fellow was a woman." "I might have guessed it. The curses have come home to roost. She has doubtless made life an insupportable burden to so many men that now it is her own turn." "Keep it up, Gerbert. You'll be a cynic yet before you're done." "This woman, was she old or young?" "A girl, sir, a mere child, not out of her teens, eh, Nash? A little slip of a thing you could blow away with a breath. With the face of a saint, sir, or an angel. Eyes which were the eyes of innocence if ever yet I saw them. And yet, by George, sir, she offered for 10,000 francs to kill the President. Kill him, sir. And she spoke as calmly as if she were telling you her size in gloves. Upon my soul, I believe she'd do it too." 10,000 francs? Was that the sum she asked?" 10,000 francs, sir. I might have understood it if she had asked 10,000,000, but for a pittance such as that "I perceive. You have yourself your price, then?" "It is strange. This woman's price is mine." "Guarantee me 10,000 francs, and I will myself kill the President with my own hands." Mr. Kennard looked at Monsieur Gerbert for some moments in silence. Then, going to the mantelpiece, he began to fill his pipe from a tobacco jar which stood upon a bracket. "Gerbert," he said, "you promised to introduce me to Madame Gerbert. When are you going to keep your promise?" "It is too late." "Don't talk nonsense." The big man had filled his pipe. As he lighted it he puffed out clouds of smoke. "Gerbert, if you've nothing particularly on, ask me to spend this evening with you. And if you've no special objection to the fellow — such as most people seem to have — I'll bring Nash." While M. Gerbert seemed hesitating, Mr. Nash spoke. "My dear Gerbert, Kennard is not only an Englishman, but I assure you he's an unusual specimen, even for an Englishman. I'll kick him if you like." Monsieur Gerbert raised himself out of the depths of Mr. Kennard's easy chair. I see no reason why you should not come. I see no reason. Monsieur Kennard, Monsieur Nash, I hope to see you in my little apartment this evening about 8. For my wife, I cannot promise. I see very little of her myself. I cannot undertake that you will see anything of her at all. But for me, to me you will be very welcome. He moved to the door. Until this evening, my friends, about 8. For some minutes after the Frenchman had gone, neither of the Englishmen said anything. Mr. Kennard, his head thrown back, his pipe between his teeth, puffed clouds of smoke towards the ceiling. He was the first to speak. Not a very genial invitation, eh, William? My dear Hugh, what it is to be heavy-footed. Did you happen to observe that the fellow was half beside himself with trouble? I did. Because you are as blind as a bat, it doesn't follow that we all are. Pause. More smoke. Should you say that the trouble is with his wife or with his money? My experience teaches me that when a man has trouble with his money, he also, as a matter of course, has trouble with his wife. End of section 15. Section 16 of The Seen and the Unseen by Richard Marsh. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sonia. 7. The Assassin. Chapter 3. Monsieur and Madame Gerbert lived, it seemed, au 5e. Mr. Kennard and Mr. Nash were conscious that, as they mounted higher, they seemed to be leaving even cleanliness behind them. The last staircase was in a state of almost dangerous dilapidation. The plaster was coming in great patches off the wall. Mr. Kennard hesitated before he knocked at the unpromising-looking door. If I had had any idea that things were so bad as this with him, he murmured. Hang me if I would have suggested coming. What a brute he must suppose I am. Mr. Nash was, as he was too apt to be, sententious. You must never infer how a Frenchman lives, or where, from his appearance at his café. They knocked 3 times, and still there was no answer. Mr. Kennard was about to propose a retreat, when Monsieur Gerbert himself opened the door. Enter, gentlemen. They entered somewhat solemnly. When they were in, Monsieur Gerbert stood with his back to the door. You see, gentlemen, this is my little apartment. I told you it was a little apartment, did I not? He had done so, but not how little, nor how bare it was of furniture. The room was a mere cock-loft. It was lighted by a tin lamp, which stood upon an old wooden table. This table, a bed in a corner, and a chair or two was practically all the furniture the place contained. It was not only the abode of poverty, it seemed to be the abode of actual destitution. Still standing with his back to the door, Monsieur Gerbert took an obviously wry-mouthed pleasure in openly avowing the fact. I heard you knock, gentlemen, 3 times. Why did I not open? Because I was ashamed. I have had the pleasure of your acquaintance now 2 years. You have known me as a gentleman, as one of yourselves. You may well believe that I felt it difficult when the moment came to prove to you that, after all, I was only a beggar, and lived in a loft. My dear Gerbert, stammered Mr. Kennard. His friend was readier. My very dear fellow, you don't suppose that you are the only man who has known what it is to be hard up. Why, I myself have slept in a doss-house, and I've been glad to have the 4pence to do it with. I understand you. I thank you, Monsieur Nash. I am now worse off than you were, as they say in the fairy tales, once upon a time. My dear Gerbert, blundered Mr. Kennard, if you had only hinted, if you had only told me. He got no further. Monsieur Gerbert continued, after a fashion of his own. If I had only told you what? You see, I still have clothes. I have a decent coat. It is true I find my shoes begin to want a little careful touching, and I do not care to allow my shirt to become too prominent, but so long as I could bear myself with decency, what was there then I should have told you? You must forgive my saying that I should have told you nothing now,
if you had not, in a measure, forced me to confession. But I seem to be lacking in hospitality. I have often been to your apartments. It is the first time you have come to mine. I beg of you to make yourselves entirely at your ease." Mr. Kennard was already tousling his hair, as was his habit when disturbed. And Madame Gerbert? My wife is gone." "Gone, Gerbert? What do you mean?" "She went from me this morning. That is what I mean." "But have you no notion where she's gone to?" "How should I have a notion? She was free to go where she chose, as free as air." "Oughtn't you to make inquiries?" "To serve what purpose? I know little, it is true, but what I know is more than enough. I know that she has become tired of me, of my poverty, of this." He stretched out his arms on either side of him. "She is but a young girl. A young girl soon becomes tired, it is only natural. But I am too much of an egotist. I weary you with trivialities. You must excuse me if I do not offer you to eat or to drink. I beg of you not to require from me too particular reasons for my seeming inhospitality." Mr. Nash was seated as much at his ease as if he had been paying the most commonplace of calls. He watched Monsieur Gerbert as though he found him unusually interesting, if only as a study. Mr. Kennard wandered about the room. Every now and then he ran his hand through his hair. He paused before a little shelf which was fixed against the wall. The only thing upon it was a photograph. He took this in his hand, and, half absent-mindedly, began to look at it. Suddenly his wits seemed to cease wool-gathering. His eyes flashed. The expression on his face betokened keen attention. He took the photograph to the table, bending over so that the lamp might show him more plainly what it was that he was looking at. "Who's this?" He was staring as if he experienced a difficulty in crediting the evidence of his own senses. "Why, it's the assassin!" Monsieur Gerbert had momentarily turned away. At the sound of Mr. Kennard's voice he turned again. "I beg your pardon?" "It's the individual who found life an insupportable burden." Monsieur Gerbert went to the table. He saw what Mr. Kennard was holding. "That is the portrait of Celestine, of my wife." "Your wife! Your wife!" Mr. Kennard's voice rose almost to a roar. "This is the girl who came to me this morning, and who in exchange for 10,000 francs offered to kill the President." Monsieur Gerbert's eyes visibly dilated. He caught at the edge of the table as if to help him to stand. "Are you sure?" "Sure!" Taking his host by the shoulder as he shouted each new insult, Mr. Kennard shook him as if he had been some naughty child. "You little mountebank! You tailor's dummy! You shell of a man!" In his excitement Mr. Kennard actually lifted his host right off his feet and held him up before him in the air. "With your attitudinizing and the rest of your folly you've driven that little girl, who loves you as only a woman can love a fool, to try to gain for you a wretched 10,000 francs in exchange, you little ass, for her own life." Mr. Nash came and laid his hand upon his impulsive friend's arm. "Steady, you." Thus recalled to himself and to the conventions of civilized society, Mr. Kennard replaced his host upon his feet upon the floor. Monsieur Gerbert seemed so taken aback by the treatment he had received as to be able, for the moment, to do nothing but pant and gape. In the sudden silence a pass-key was heard being inserted in the door without. It was opened. A woman came in. It was the woman who, that morning, had visited Mr. Kennard. "Alphonse!" she exclaimed. "What is it?" She caught sight of Mr. Kennard, and knew him. "Monsieur Hugh Kennard! Mon Dieu!" She crouched back against the wall as if she would shrink right through it if she could. One could see that she was trembling in every limb. Her veil was up, so that one perceived that even the muscles of her face were trembling. In the uncertain light she looked more childish even than she had done in the morning. Mr. Kennard moved forward. "My child," he said. "No, no!" She put up her hands as if to ward him from her. "Alphonse! Alphonse! Do not let him touch me!" It was pitiful to see her. It almost seemed as if it was these three men against this one little girl. In the face of her too obvious aversion, Mr. Kennard all at once was tongue-tied. As usual, Mr. Nash was more self-possessed than his friend. He touched his host gently on the arm. "Gerbert, may I beg from you the honour of an introduction to madame?" Monsieur Gerbert appeared to be struggling with a waking dream. As his faculties returned, with a slight gesture he, as it were, brushed Mr. Nash aside. "Permit me." He advanced till he stood quite close to the woman cowering against the wall. He looked at her for a moment in silence. "Ah, it is you." He turned to Mr. Kennard. "I believe, Mr. Kennard, that you are a larger man than I. On the other hand, and at the same time, it is true I am a beggar." The big man was evidently in a state of mental confusion. He had eyes only for the girl quivering against the wall. "My dear Gerbert, upon my soul, I beg your pardon. Won't you introduce me to Madame Gerbert?" "To Madame Gerbert!" Clasping his hands behind his back, Monsieur Gerbert fell into a pose which, if we are to believe the painters, was a favourite one of the first Napoleon's. "It appears that you already are acquainted with Madame Gerbert." "The acquaintance is of an informal kind." "So I should imagine." The red-haired little man addressed himself to his girl wife. His words seemed to make her quiver as if they had been so many lashes from a whip. "So it is you. I thought that you had gone." "Alphonse," was all she said. "I imagined when this morning you left me that you observed that you never would set eyes on me again." "Alphonse!" "You told me a few things, but was it because you forgot that you omitted to tell me that, so soon as you were outside my door, you were going to pay a visit to a strange man?" "Alphonse!" The woman put up her hands to cover her face. Mr. Kennard grasped his friend's arm with, perhaps, unconscious vigour. "I shall murder this little brute in a minute," he murmured. As he whispered a response, Mr. Nash disengaged his arm from his friend's too vigorous grasp. "Did I not tell you that the French have their own point of view, and that we have ours?" Monsieur Gerbert had continued to gaze in silence at his wife. As if moved with the courage of desperation, taking her hands from before her face, she ventured to make an attempt to offer some sort of plea in self-defence. "Alphonse, I did it for you." "For me?" Monsieur Gerbert tapped his hand against his breast. "It was for me that you paid a visit to a strange man?" "It was a little plot which I had formed to gain for you the 10,000 francs, of which, you know, you are in need. I had thought to gain them for you, in exchange for my life, so that my death might be worth something to you, though my life had been worth nothing at all. And, Alphonse, husband, I have only returned to tell you that I think I have gained for you the sum which you require." "The sum which I require? My wife? At what price?" The strangest smile flitted across the girl's face as she held out her hands and answered. "What does it matter?" "To you, nothing at all. To me, everything. I have my good name, I have my honour." Monsieur Gerbert crossed his arms upon his chest. "Already because of you my honour has been dragged in the dust. Your English friend has used me as if I were a thing of the gutter, here in my own apartment." Mr. Kennard interposed. "I do assure you, my dear Gerbert, that it was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" 4'6" glowered up at 6'4". Before the pygmy the giant seemed to cower. "It is a misunderstanding, Monsieur Kennard, which can only be explained with your life, or with mine." "Alphonse, my husband!" The girl advanced. The man shrank back. "Madame Gerbert, have the goodness not to defile me with your touch. To the other things which you have brought me it but remained to add dishonour. That also you have brought me, last of all.
Since, therefore, you have lied to me, and have returned to crush me into eternity with the last offering of your shame, which, unfortunately, because it is yours, 1,000 times more is mine, for me it but remains to go." M. Gerbert made a movement towards the door. Mr. Kennard caught him by the shoulder. "Gerbert, don't be a fool." In an instant M. Gerbert was like a wild cat in a frenzy. Leaping up at Mr. Kennard, he attacked him, literally, tooth and nail. He poured forth language which was not only unparliamentary, but also unprintable. The big man, in his turn, was so taken by surprise that he made not the slightest attempt even at defence. The first paroxysm of his fury exhausted, the little man stamped on the floor and shrieked with rage. "If I had but a pistol!" he screamed. His wife, who was standing a yard or two away from him, took something from the pocket of her dress. "I have a revolver," she said. She proved it by discovering that she had such a weapon in her hand. It was probably the same one with which, in the morning, she had kept Mr. Kennard at a distance. Mr. Nash called out to his friend. "Keep tight hold of him, you! Don't let him get near it for your life." Madame Gerbert turned to him with that air of simple seriousness which was so like the exaggerated seriousness of a little child. "It is not for my husband. It is for me." Before they had a suspicion of her purpose, she placed the barrel of the revolver against her brow and fired. It was done so quickly that, although Mr. Kennard rushed forward, while the words were still, as it were, upon her lips, he was only in time to put his arm about her body as it was falling, dead. End of section 16.